Welcome to the latest episode of the Project Liberal podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Eckel, joined as always by my co-host in recovery, back at his office and his desk after back surgery. How are you feeling?
Finally. I'm good. I'm feeling much better. I've finally been able to get up and walk around for the past week and a half, so
Good.
I'm getting there.
Good. Okay. Well, today we're joined by a guest who I'm incredibly honored to have on the show. She is one of the members of our advisory board, as well as a very well-known thinker in the topic of authoritarianism. I want to take a minute to introduce her. Her name is Shikha Dalmia. I hope I did not strip your last name, Shikha. If I did, I apologize. Perfect. Perfect. So Shikha is the president for the Institute for the Study of Modern Authoritarianism. She's also the founder of the Unpopulist Magazine. And she describes herself as a reformist libertarian fighting populist authoritarianism. And Shikha, we're huge fans of your voice and the things that you speak out about. So thank you for taking time to talk to us. Greatly appreciated.
Thanks for having me on, Josh and Jonathan. It's a pleasure. And just one little pitch for my Substack. It's free, nonpopulist.net. And so please subscribe.
Awesome.
Got some great content on there.
Absolutely. And you'll see that on the Project Liberal channels. We try to boost it as much as we can because we are also huge fans of that content. So let me frame everything real quick, Shikha, and then I'll just kind of tee you off on the first major topic. So it's no secret to the three of us on the call and for most of the people in our audience that illiberalism is on a rise around the globe. It's not just in the United States, it's in countries across the world. It feels like liberal democracy is under threat. It feels like authoritarianism is finding a new stronghold in political environments everywhere. And there are a lot of people wondering how to navigate this new multipolar world with this threat of authoritarianism looming on the horizon. And obviously, you being an expert in the study of these types of things, we wanted to talk to you a bit about that. And so it's okay to kick you off or, kick off the conversation. I wanted to see whether you had any thoughts on what do you think the primary drivers of this recent surge that we're seeing are, and kind of what do you think the causes of it are and how it's showing up in societies around the world?
So it's a big question.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think it's a little too much to call me an expert on it. I'm just a purveyor of what other people think and write and add a little bit of my own evaluation to that. But, to back up a little, interestingly, Samuel Huntington, who was this Harvard political scientist, 2 years after the Berlin Wall fell, he said, the world had basically experienced 3 waves of liberalization, democratization. The first wave was after the 1820s in the United States when all American white American men got franchised. And that wave continued for a long time. And, countries like France and Germany started expanding the franchise. Then he said the second wave of democratization was after the Second World War, 1945, after the fall of, Germany, fascist regime, Japan, imperial regime, and the triumph of liberal democracies led to the spread of liberalism around the world. I mean, and my own native country, India, was one of those countries that actually democratized after the Second World War. We'll get to that in a second. It was a bit of an anomaly because, one of the predictors of liberalization was certain degree of economic wealth, which India didn't have. It was actually a very poor country at that time.
Sure.
But, so there was another wave of democratization at that time. And then the third wave happened actually, after the fall of communism. But then that was sort of looking backward and trying to make sense of what had happened. But one of the interesting things he said in that was, he said each of the previous waves had been followed by a reversal. That there was, every time there had been this rapid democratization, there was pushback. And, and so you saw a lot of the gains lost. And he predicted this would happen after this third wave of liberalization. And almost as if on cue, 2005, 2006, this democratic slump started happening. Much of the whole Arab Spring, that hope was quashed at that time. People thought it was going to democratize. China started after like a stellar period of economic liberalization. People thought it was going to politically liberalize. That started backsliding. Europe started coming under the sway of certain far-right ideologies that have just increased and grown. And India, my country, my native country, I mean, that starting in around 2014, it was a pretty established liberal democracy. And I think to me, that's kind of like in some ways the most dramatic, outside of America, the most dramatic setback in liberal democracy. All of this started happening at the same time. And so it's an interesting question, why? Why did this happen? Now, one of the theories is kind of like Frank Fukuyama pushes, is that he's a liberal Democrat, big fan of liberalism, is fighting the good fight. But he also thinks that liberalism, especially the rapid economic liberalization, produced a lot of losers. And from trade, from immigration, free flow of people, what have you. And he didn't think liberal democracies had good systems and safety nets in place, to deal with sort of these, what he calls the losers of globalization and liberalization.
Yep.
There are other theories too. I frankly don't agree with this theory because, India is not, nobody in India is a loser of globalization or liberalization, right? India has eradicated poverty, very rapidly after liberalization. So some people may have benefited more and some people may have benefited less, but can't say that there are any real losers of this, of any of this. Neither is China. I think the West is a somewhat more complicated case. But the fact is that the economic effect is so unevenly distributed that you can't really pin this global phenomenon on just such a sort of uneven, outcomes at best of
Sure.
what they are saying. My own theory is this, and take it for whatever it is. I think, liberalism it's the kind of system that is going to breed discontent from all sides. Nobody is going to be happy with liberalism. And there are a number of what liberalism essentially does, in my view. It is an anti-majoritarian institution. It is supposed to put a break on sort of majoritarian power and very often the tyranny that comes with majoritarian power. And the outcome of that is that the dominant group's majority is always somewhat unhappy because they feel like, if they had a pure democracy or they could use force, they could get their way much more frequently because they have the numbers on their side. So they are always somewhat unhappy with liberalism. And I think minorities are unhappy with liberalism because liberalism is a deliberative, political system. It doesn't allow change to happen rapidly. And so minorities who've been promised, certain
Yep.
things under liberalism, equality, justice, all of that, are unhappy with it. And so after a while, when liberalism has been tried for a while, these discontents start to like prop up and there's pushback. And I think something like that, in my view, is what is happening, which is why you're getting illiberalism not only from the right, which to me is the bigger threat right now, but there are also illiberal tendencies on the left, which sees itself as a champion of progressive causes.
That's an interesting thought. So effectively, you're saying that the framework of a liberalism, of liberal political systems will, in effect, create this discontent over a period of time. I am curious because, as you mentioned, it seems to be that there's a kind of a rubber banding effect. So, you've got some sort of political contentedness, and then it kind of, as you see, these massive waves where we see the rise of populist authoritarianism. Do you think that, I guess I should ask is, and what I'm hearing is that indicative of the liberal system and it's kind of on liberals to fight back against that? I mean, do you feel like there are any other factors, maybe if we just talk about the United States specifically, that are contributing to this rise, other than maybe just general political discontent and that ebb and flow over time?
Yeah, just should clarify that, when I say, there is something cyclical to all of this, right?
Sure.
That, you get liberalism and then you get a backlash against illiberalism and you get some varieties of authoritarianisms. Then there's discontent against those authoritarianism and you get maybe something else comes out of that, hopefully liberalism.
Right.
So there's nothing metaphysical or mystical about it. I mean, it is sort of, just how human affairs proceed. But what is weird to me about the current moment and this backlash against liberalism is that it has been, in many ways, a very, very successful, political arrangement, right? I mean, in the history of the world, you haven't had such a long period of peace, right? Like, I mean, you have had wars, but nothing like the, two great wars and, what have you. It's also delivered like, the great enrichment, great deal of prosperity. And so this backlash, there is something slightly, weird about it to me. And, and I think ultimately, you mentioned the word populist authoritarianism, right? And one of the things that Huntington had said was, he had said that, when this backlash to the third wave of liberalism arises, he wasn't sure what the authoritarianism would look like. And it could, because Weimar Germany, led to fascism, which nobody could have predicted, right? Like nobody thought that illiberalism and authoritarianism would take that form. And he was a little bit uncertain what form it would take again, when it transpired. What's interesting to me is that it's taking this populist form, right? And populist authoritarianism, to me, is in some ways, the most insidious and the dangerous kind of authoritarianisms, because in a liberal polity, you depend upon the people to guard their liberties, right? I mean, that's a core principle of American, the American political system of checks and balances. The people rise up and they, demand their freedom and they resist the tyrant. In a populist system, the people and the people are one with the authoritarian, right? Like they think that the authoritarian is,
Yes.
Represents them.
Represents
Speaks
them,
for them. Yeah.
speaks for them, and and is implementing their will. And so you can't count on the people to be a check on the authoritarian, right? And this is kind of like what is happening worldwide right now. I mean, if you see in India, it may be a religious nationalism, but it is very much backed by populist sentiment, by majoritarian populist sentiment. I think the same, to some extent, was happening in Israel, definitely in Turkey, Poland, Hungary,
Yeah.
Italy, France, and definitely, of course, in the United States. And this populism is, to me, this comes to your question, Josh, this is, ultimately, it's a dominant group backlash, right? It is the discontent largely of like majoritarian groups, people who are dominant, who threatened by, this sort of like questioning of the status quo and the redistribution of certain, rights and privileges. And so that's what's happening right now. That's kind of like the rubber band effect. That's kind of where we are getting this backlash to liberalism from, is kind of like this populist element.
And
I think one of liberalism's greatest weakness is also its greatest strength, right? That stop on majoritarian power means that not everybody's going to be, not as many people are going to be, might be happy with the current political system, but we certainly are better off when we do place those stops on the, on the majority and say, whoa, we need to hold back here. That also, I think, creates a situation where multiple minority groups, bound by whatever, ties that bring them together, can become a majoritarian group to specifically impede on other people's liberty. And that's where I think liberalism can really, it's not, again, I think it's one of its greatest strengths, but it's also one of its greatest weaknesses in protecting against these minority groups coming together and and pushing for these illiberal reforms.
And John, to add to that, and real quick, and maybe get your thoughts on this, Shikha, I find it ironic because I see a lot of these conversations happening online all the time, and I find it ironic that it is exactly what you said, John. It's like this coalition of different minority groups that have become what is
Look
effectively
who Trump has pulled together.
right. And there are within these minority groups, like some of the ones I see the most, we actually they engage with us all the time. Is this group called the post liberals, which are a group of like these very Catholic. I'd say call them Catholic extremists. I don't know how else to describe them, and they are in and of themselves a pretty minority or like an extreme minority within American society, but they've convinced themselves that if somehow they can tear down a liberal democracy, they're going to rise up to become the arbiters of morality,
the next society.
Law. Yeah, and it's like this delusion that they're somehow going to be the ones running the shot. So maybe that's a good pivot to the next question, Shikha, is how do you feel like you can get through to those people? Because I look at those people and many of the people within this coalition as effectively arguing for the system that will be their own downfall. And I feel like if you could find a way to articulate that to them and make it coherent, it might fracture the entire coalition. But yeah, I'm curious as whether you've seen the same thing, whether you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, right? Yeah, you're right. Like sort of the Catholic post-liberals are the weirdest of them all.
They really are.
Right?
Yeah.
Because Catholics are a minority in this country, and they are a minority within the Catholic minority, right?
Yep.
Like, so how do they think that they can wrest the levers of power and like impose their will? But actually, they do have a theory. I mean, if you read Adrian Vermeule, who's one of their key theoreticians, he has this idea where you first elect a sympathetic president, and then you don't get rid of the bureaucracy and the civil state, right? Like the administrative state, you co-opt it. You put your people in key positions of power, and then you just shove, their agenda down the throat of the populace.
Yeah.
And of course, you do away with democracy because if you give the people a chance, at that point they will rise, I guess, against this tyrant, and so you have one man, one vote, one time kind of a thing.
Yep.
I guess that's what their view is. But they are a weird minority. I mean, minorities are typically part of like the progressive coalition, right? And what you just said is exactly what I say to them. It is true that in a liberal democracy, your agenda and your aspirations are not going to proceed at a rapid fire pace, right? There is going to have to be deliberation. You are going to have to talk to other groups with whom you disagree. You're going to have to convince them. You're going to have to win hearts and minds. But the alternative is, if you tear down liberalism, what you have is pure majoritarian power of whatever group is dominant. And that is never going to redound to your benefit, right? I mean, that is a situation. I mean, that's what majority groups want. They want to exert raw power. They want to be freed from the constraints of, liberal norms, liberal institutions, checks and balances, to just impose their raw democratic will or raw will. And they can do it by two means. They can do it through elections because they have greater numbers, or because they have greater numbers, they can also, use violence and force. Either way, it's not going to redound to your benefit. So yes, you have discontents, and yes, things may not move as rapidly as you can, but there really is no better alternative. This is the best way to, go about it. Let me add one more thing. One of the things that you're seeing on the right is, in some ways, a backlash. Some of it is, I agree with you, there have been excesses on the left. I mean, they've gone a bit too far on, all kinds of things, including disinviting speakers from campuses and what have you. A little bit of that is overblown, but there is certainly a grain of truth to that. And what you hear from the right is that the reason Donald Trump is so popular is because minority groups, or the left that represents minority groups, now controls the commanding heights of our culture, right? Like every cultural institution, whether it is universities or Hollywood or media, legacy media, is now controlled by the progressive left. And so they need political power to push back against it. Now, there is, and I think there is truth to that, but I think that's not illicit. Minority groups have a hard time wending their way through the political process because the deck, to some extent, is always stacked against them. So they have to do some kind of an end run and go to cultural institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't see it as illicit. I think ultimately, if all change has to happen through political means and deliberative means, the influence of those cultural institutions is tempered and based out. And I think minority groups need to understand that's how it works in a liberal democracy.
I also wonder how much of kind of America's turn towards liberalism is really partly because the left has had wins, right? The right looks at the left and sees all these wins that it's had. They've gotten gay marriage passed. They've gotten a few, marks in the win column. Whereas the right feels like, well, what do we have? We got a few tax cuts here and there, right? So I wonder how much of this pushback that we're seeing is really because the right looks at the results from politics and say, well, we haven't had any wins since when? Well, we got Roe v. They just had Roe v. Wade overturned, but I don't see that as satisfying them as putting a political win because that was a judicial decision, right? So I wonder how much that has to play into that kind of that psyche of because they really have this kind of, we're a victim of the culture, of politics, of institutions. And that victimhood also really spirals into a lot of conspiratorial thinking. So you'll see, you talked about progressives taking over a lot of institutions. Instead of them kind of doing a little bit of soul searching, be like, okay, we're just out of touch on a lot of issues. They say, oh no, it's this grand scheme. It's them, and in three parentheses, right? It's them behind everything, controlling things. And so I think that we've just kind of not created, but it's just this scenario is kind of developed in the United States where this persecution complex, this conspiratorial thinking has all kind of swelled up into a unified movement. And that's a dangerous place to be.
I think I wonder partially just how much of this is due to the fact that Trump as an individual is an aberration. He's such a unique individual that really because of his his half a century of experience at brand building, he found a way to energize low information voters in a way that I don't think any other politician could. But obviously that's already happened and that's in the past. But you talked about this a little earlier, Shikha, around how you feel like the illiberal right or the authoritarian populists are the biggest threat right now in American society. And I definitely agree with you. I don't think that same thing holds true in countries around the world based on the context that you're talking about. But I think the United States, you're completely correct. So I'd like to pivot just to a broad conversation around that threat and kind of how you see that threat materializing. What do you think the biggest, not necessarily what led to it, but why do you feel like it is the biggest threat right now over, say, other threats that other people have spent a lot of time thinking about or being concerned about?
Yeah. I'll just to back up to Jonathan's point for a second.
Yeah.
No, I think you are right that white majority groups are feeling they have had no political wins in the last many years. Actually, but the reality is it's not true, right? They have had, they've controlled, the presidency, since the beginning of this century. Bush was president for 2 terms, Obama was president for 2 terms, and so they've controlled the presidency equally. In Congress, they have controlled the Congress far more than I think the Democrats are. I think that's accurate.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Roe v. Wade. That's true. On a lot of religious liberty cases, right? They have won. And David French has been writing a lot about that. So, and free speech, technically, based on the protections from state, free speech has never been on a more secure footing.
100%.
And so, to some extent, it's a question of narrative making, right? And again, if you look at America's history after the Revolutionary War, there was a huge backlash because just the people who stood to lose from the Reconstruction effort were a powerful political force, and they pretty much aborted, the Reconstruction and the more equitable distribution of power to blacks, and replaced slavery with the system of Jim Crow. Right. I mean, and so you always have kind of like whenever there is progress, there is also backlash. And I think, you are seeing certain backlash from, majoritarian groups in this country. I hate to say white because it's not about whiteness to
Yeah.
me. It is about domination. And you see it in different countries with different groups that are not white, right? Hindus are not whites, but they are the dominant group and they are trying to protect their dominance. So dominant group, protection is to me a better term. And Josh, to your point, I mean, why is it more dangerous? I mean, it is more dangerous because I think majorities are always more dangerous than minorities are. They just by virtue of their numbers, they can control cultural institutions. Yes, legacy media has got a liberal bias, but look at how the right has responded with like a whole juggernaut of right-wing radio and talk show hosts whose reach is much bigger than that of legacy media. And so so just their sheer numbers, make them just much more potent. And Daniel Ziblatt, who is a Harvard professor, another political scientist, he's written quite a bit on how liberal democracy simply cannot survive without the buy-in of the right. And his point is that progressives who are representing minority groups, to some extent, even in their excesses, most of them realize that liberalism kind of redounds to their benefits. But the right and dominant groups very rarely do. So they have to be sold on the case for liberal democracy to stick. And I think that consensus on the right has so badly unraveled in this country and other countries that I think that's kind of where the danger is.
That's actually a good pivot then to another broad topic, because I feel like this is the reason why we started Project Liberal, is because I see a complete transformation of the coalitions that have been commonplace in American politics for the last 10 or 20 years. The things that I took for granted growing up, coming out of college, the ground is shifting beneath our feet from a perspective of who are real allies and who are not. And the reason why we started the project was because we wanted to find a way to unify people that care about liberal values and create an organization that can exert some sort of electoral influence on their behalf. And we're obviously very early into this project, but we've seen a lot of promise related to that, because I think the new coalition that really forms as a reaction to illiberal populism, it has to be centered around liberalism first and foremost. And I think people intuitively understand that. And that's one of the reasons why I think we've seen so much growth so quickly. But the thing that I find interesting is I have seen people that have for decades considered themselves to be Republicans that are out there advocating loudly and proudly to vote for somebody like Biden, who is politically, as I think all of us on this call know, from a policy perspective, very, very opposed to a lot of the things that they stand for. I mean, I think it speaks to these coalitions. And I know you, I think, wrote an op-ed about this in 2020, and I know you've spent some time talking about it. So I'm curious as to how you're navigating the electoral realities of 2024 in light of that, and how do you think through that problem and think through that decision?
It's a very good question, Josh. I mean, the global authoritarian fever, it's still growing, but only one country in recent years has broken through it, and it's Poland. Poland threw out the Law and Justice Party, PiS, and replaced it with this coalition called the Civic Coalition. And the Civic Coalition was essentially a coalition of all opposition parties which had united around kind of liberal institutions.
Yep.
And they buried the hatchet on their policy differences, which were enormous. And they came around this idea of, that we need to defend liberalism and we need to defend liberal institutions. and they got together and they actually formed a coalition government. Now, they did it at a time. PIS had been in power for about 8 years and hadn't had the time for the kind of authoritarian consolidation that you're seeing in countries like Hungary. And which is why I think America is at a very, very critical, pivotal point. And I can't tell you how much it irritates me when somebody says we are not facing existential stakes right now, because we are.
Yep.
I think if Trump comes back, you are going to see a massive increase in liberalism and the diminution of liberal institutions. I mean, he's already said he's going to be a dictator. Then he qualifies it and says for a day, but who's he kidding, right?
Yeah.
He's got like this whole agenda of how he is going to hollow out civil service agencies and put his loyalists in place of civil servants. And don't get me wrong, I am, as skeptical of bureaucrats and civil servants as the next person. But the way he wants to do it, he doesn't want to streamline the bureaucracy and make it more rational. He just wants to co-opt it.
That's right.
He does not believe in the independence of, agencies that are supposed to be a check on political corruption, Department of Justice, what have you. He, also is an economic authoritarian, every bit, if not more, than some of the, economic authoritarians on the left. So, down the line, to me, Trump is going to be a big problem, and he's going to result all the institutions that were able to somehow keep him in check in his first term are not going to be that effective next time around, and you will see much more authoritarian consolidation over here in the United States, just as you've seen in Hungary and other countries. So to me, this is like a pivotal moment, and the only way to really push back against it, Josh, as you said, a coalition of liberal entities. And I think just as in Poland, I think it's beginning to happen. The Reagan, era conservatism consisted of, the three-legged stool of conservatism, like neoconservatives, paleo-traditionalists, and then free market libertarians. I think that now he needs to yield to a liberal coalition where you get all the strains of conservatives who see the threat to this illiberalism from the right, and join forces with progressives who likewise are concerned about defending liberalism. The problem in the United States is, unlike other countries, it's not a parliamentary system, so you can't have a coalition government, and you have a duopoly. And if the Republican Party is going to collapse into this kind of like authoritarianism and completely give in to Trump's whims, that really leaves only the Democratic Party as the game in town, and it's a very, very dangerous, it's a very dangerous moment.
Yeah.
The thing that worries me about a Trump second term is when his first term happened, the people he brought on board as staff and cabinet members were traditional conservatives by and large. They were mostly your normal, dyed-in-the-wool, mostly free market, froze free speech. But the coalition that he's going to be bringing in, we speak about liberal coalition opposing them, but the coalition that Trump will bring into a second term is going to be an entirely different MAGA-only, America first, completely anti-immigrant, anti-free trade, anti-free speech. And that's what really concerns me about Trump in a second term.
Yeah.
Do I think that American institutions can hold up against it? Boy, I hope so. I really hope so. But if he goes in there and says, okay, I'm going to appoint, I'm going to do what FDR did and I'm going to stack the Supreme Court, all bets are off.
Yeah, not only that, but I mean, he's explicitly said he wants to bring, somebody like Michael Flynn, who's literally publicly called for a coup against the government. Not only that as well, but I mean, to the point that you made earlier, he's explicitly referenced Orban as effectively the new model for American conservatism. You cannot be more loud and prominent with the fact, I mean, he's confirming everything you said, Sheikh. I mean, it's not hidden. It's very public. He's said it very, very publicly, and he's got large organizations like Heritage, for example, that are enabling that and are planning to enable that. And he can't do that alone. He's going to have allies. So that's a very interesting thing. So then a question for you, Shikha, is what actions do you think Biden should take or maybe hazards to avoid in order to provide an off-ramp to people? And the reason I asked that question is because we had Congressman Joe Walsh on the show a couple of weeks ago, and he told us, he said, when Biden took office, he should have moved to the center, and he should have been very loud that we're building a centrist liberal coalition, and he kind of should have told the far left to kind of be quiet and get and not kick them out of the coalition, right? But make sure that they were less featured. And I think that's the biggest thing that I hear from people is like, I can't support Biden because he's got it's that far left influence in his administration. Do you feel the same way Joe does? Do you have any thoughts for how you feel like they have to react in order to make sure they don't drop the ball to protect democracy?
So, first, I actually don't see Biden as a radical. I mean, he has governed as a centrist, and I think to a very, very large extent, he has, not he has not indulged the far left, right? And let me just say one thing: the far left in the Democratic Party, and this maybe will give your listeners a heart attack, is not as bad as the far right on the Republican side, right? Like to me, AOC is not as bad as, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's just openly trucking in conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia.
And speaking at events with literal Nazis that have called to exterminate non-Jews. Yeah.
Exactly. So there is, first of all, like no equivalence over there, right? And one of the things that I'm afraid of is if in the next Trump term, he just kind of like pulls all stops and turns into a real authoritarian, right? I don't think we are going to be able to convince our leftist friends to not respond in kind. They are basically going to say if the right is not going to play by the rules of a liberal democracy and engage in kind of normal transactional politics and talk to us and, and pass laws and, what have you, and is just going to gut out the civil service and co-opt the Department of Justice, then we are going to do the same. Yeah. And to me, that's the terrifying thing. And I hope, Biden is framing the next election as a fight between liberalism and authoritarianism. And I think that's the right framing. Yeah. And I hope he kind of like doubles down on that and puts, and shows how he's going to be committed to liberalism against this, against the possible takeover by an authoritarian right. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. It does make sense. I hope he does as well. There's a lot riding on those decisions. And so, yeah, I couldn't agree more.
I would love to see him, hey, throw a few bones to that conservative group that he's trying to say, hey, listen, okay, I hear you. Our taxes are a bit too high. Let's figure that. Okay, let's work on the deficit. Let's work on the national debt. Like, these are all things that you wouldn't piss anybody on the left over if he just addressed some of these things. I just don't see him actually doing that. And so I think that digging in and trenching is worrying.
To play devil's advocate on that, and Shikha, you might be right behind me on this one. I'd say I have seen him hit them from the right on like the border issue, and he has marketed himself.
The issue that I don't want him to hit them on. Yeah, right? I don't want him to hit them on the border issue. I want open borders. Just give me that one thing like Democrat. If you're going to be a Democrat on one thing, at least be on that.
Yeah, no, I get you.
If you're going to be far left on anything, be far left on the border.
So, here is the interesting thing. I mean, Biden is essentially a liberal with illiberal tendencies, right? And Trump is just an, illiberal with fascist tendencies.
Yep.
But, Biden at least... I agree with you on immigration is just the wrong issue, right? Like, I feel very strongly about that.
Yep.
Right now, the problem is that on something like fiscal discipline, because Republicans have given up on it, Trump, in his 4 years, spent more than Obama did in his 8 years. And Obama, the cost of, the financial bailout after the meltdown was included. And in Trump's 4 years, the cost of the COVID bailout was not included. Yeah. So, Trump has been just such a profligate president and so fiscally irresponsible that he's deeply shifted the Overton window on it, which both creates an opportunity for Democrats, but also one they are not going to take. They could wrest the fiscal discipline issue from conservatives and draw in some fiscal conservatives, right? But I think what they are going to do is this competitive economic populism and give more free handouts and more redistribution and other kinds of things. So I have very little hope that Biden is going to give that to us, Jonathan. Sorry to disappoint you.
I agree. It is a tragedy, but and I've already seen that. Like, we're talking about that he rolled out that program for credits for buying a home, I believe, and we're talking about student loan forgiveness.
Student loan, that to me was one of the most authoritarian things that Biden did, and not just, illiberal things, because he just totally, circumvented Congress and did it through executive order, and that to me was like a real low point for Biden in my book.
Agreed. Okay, well, we have a couple more minutes because we want to try to get you back before your hard stop. But I do want to maybe pivot to something a little bit more hopeful, or at least something that could be a little bit forward thinking. So I think we're very aligned on the current threats, and I see a lot of logic behind a lot of the things you said in regards to this new liberal coalition. What do you think maybe movements like ours or other people should do? I mean, have you, in your work on this, have you seen effective tactics or strategies to fight back against authoritarianism, or have any just commentary on maybe a go forward for liberals and the vision that you would set for them in order to fight them?
It's such a hard question. I think for me, there is a short-term, medium-term, and a long-term to defeating sort of this rise of populist authoritarianism. I think in the short term, we just have to do whatever we can to defeat Trump, right? Like he is, if he gets reelected, as we discussed, it's going to be existential, and so that's kind of like the short term, and we've got to make whatever case we need to the American public. In the medium term, I really do think there is a problem with our electoral system, that it to some extent has started incentivizing sort of the more polarizing, more extremist candidates. And I think we need to think about reforms, ranked choice voting, proportional representation, things that we can do. Yeah. I also think we need to, this is also a moment when our progressive friends have suddenly woken up to the problems of overweening executive authority, right? Yep. And I think they are thinking about it much more than they have in the past, and we should work with them to fireproof the presidency as best as we can. So in fact, I'm working on a editorial series on fireproofing the presidency, so I think there may be some low-hanging fruits to defend against an authoritarian president, like fix the Insurrection Act, take away his emergency powers, bring back the War Powers Act. So there are lots of things that we can do. And in the long run, I think there needs to be a cultural reset. We just have to make the case why liberalism is the political system that can help us deal with the problems of the 21st century, right? Whether it is race issues, equality issues, climate change, what have you. So we've got to keep harping on the case of, for liberalism, showcasing its many accomplishments, and also pointing out that life on the other side of liberalism is nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah.
That's what happens.
I always like to say, all the alternatives to liberal democracy have been tried in history, and they've all been far greater failures to liberal democracy in terms of prosperity, peace, any number of metrics that improve human lives. Liberal democracy doesn't have an equal. Doesn't mean we won't come up with something better in the future. But right now, all the proposed alternatives to liberal democracy are just failed ideas from history.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I want to touch on one more thing before we close, because you mentioned this as the medium-term goal. We've had a lot of conversations internally about what the electoral strategy should be post-Trump. And, let's say one of the things that we're wrestling with, and I'm curious as to how you think through this challenge, is I am on the same boat as you. I do think that, a lot of the problems we see are they're a consequence of the fact that we have extremists driving the boat, right, or driving the ship, running the ship. And that's due to exactly what you said. It's due to the fact that primaries are increasingly appealing to extremists. It's due to the voting system, that the first past the post. It's due to gerrymandering. It's due to a lot of other things. But one of the things I heard that I thought was compelling was a lot of young people. We polled our audience and said, okay, if we did a big political campaign, what should we focus on? Should we focus on fixing democracy? Should we focus on maybe immigration, or should we focus on affordable housing? And I heard a lot of people say, and I thought this was very interesting, that a lot of the populist stuff has to do with the fact that homes are very expensive, the cost of living is very expensive, and like especially Gen Z and millennials have a very difficult time starting a family because of a lot of the NIMBYs and a lot of the rejection of liberal markets or like in the housing market. And they were like, well, you worry about democracy, just fix the housing thing first and fix the cost of living thing first, and then the populism will have less juice to it, and then you focus on democracy and then other things. So I'm curious, do you see that same thing? How do you think about that? Because I thought that was compelling when I heard that argument.
Yeah, it's it's an interesting argument, right? But I mean, again, in a liberal, so to back up a little, fix the rising price of housing. How? That's a policy conversation.
Yes, it
both
is.
sides are going to have something to say about that. There are supply side solutions, there are demand side solutions, right? But you need to establish the political rules in which that conversation needs to happen, which brings you to liberalism, right? I mean, I often, I hear people complaining about, the loss of free speech and, what have you. And I keep saying that, or free enterprise is endangered. And I keep saying that, you can't have free enterprise outside of a foundation of a liberal order. You need to secure the order first. You can't have, economic liberty and political tyranny. I guess you can. I mean, you have it in China, but it's not a great system.
Yeah.
It doesn't do a whole lot of people a lot of good. So you really do need to stabilize the liberal order first before you can have these policy conversations. Otherwise, to me, these policy conversations keep getting sucked into the cultural war, right? I mean, there are so many issues, like even something COVID, response to COVID, which was one of the, the greatest health emergencies, humankind has ever faced. And in previous times, outside of the culture war, there would have been some kind of a political consensus, whether you and I agreed on it or not, right? But some kind of political consensus would have emerged because there was trust in the system, liberal institutions were working, people were talking to each other. Now, everything got sucked into the culture wars. And so to me, if we are going to extricate ourselves from this sort of dynamic of polarization and culture warring, we've got to kind of somehow stabilize the liberal order first. Otherwise, none of these policy solutions are really going to stick, in my view.
Yeah, I think it's a very compelling case.
If we don't fix how we dialogue and how we come to decisions that we have to come to decisions about, we're not going to be able to get anything past that. We might get a few wins or losses here and there, but otherwise, if we don't fix the decision-making process, which is really at the core of a lot of these issues,
right,
there's only going to be a few wins or losses here or there.
And that's an incredibly difficult thing. I ran a 501c4 for a while that did work basically on advocacy for ballot access. And I tell you what, man, there's nothing that brings Republicans and Democrats together like trying to protect their power. I am glad to hear that. There are a lot of people on the left, as you mentioned, and I have seen this, especially among the young new liberals, waking up to this and realizing that systems matter. And that has given me a lot of encouragement to see that, especially on the left, because that's a much bigger conversation than I think it's ever been since I paid attention to it. But okay, we're about the end. Shikha, John, I don't know if you have any other questions. I just want
to say we just had 2 back-to-back podcasts on immigration, but I want to have you back about immigration at some point in the future. That was my only final thought.
Anytime. I mean, that's an issue after my heart. I've been writing about it for 25 years. And so, yes, anytime.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, let me say, for the sake of our audience, and Shikha, I'll let you take us out if you've got anything else you want to plug. But check out the unpopulist.net and the Substack there. There's an incredible wealth of knowledge and amazing content that's coming out on that every day. Shikha, do you have anything else that you'd like our audience to check out or maybe read or learn about before you go?
No. Well, let me just say one thing. We are planning to have a conference on liberalism for the 21st century on July 11th and 12th. And the idea is to bring, the NatCons, National Conservatives, they have their confabs every year and multiple times a year where they have like a show of strength. They bring the who's who of every liberal strain of the right. But we don't have anything like that on the liberal side, right? And there are many liberals of many different political orientations, centrist, center right, center left, who are also defending liberalism, but we don't bring them together in one place and make a case for liberalism and answer their critics. And so we are planning to do that in July. So there'll be more announcements for it forthcoming. So stay tuned.
Awesome. Beautiful stuff. Okay, well, Shikha, again, thank you for your time. Thank you for everything you do in your advocacy and your work. For our audience sake, if you're curious to learn more about Project Liberal, we're a nonpartisan political PAC that was dedicated to defend and advocate for the liberal values in American politics. You can join our website and get on our mailing list at projectliberal.org. If you're interested in helping contribute to the mission or the vision of the organization, you can become a member, $25 a month. That's projectliberal.org/member. And you can follow us on Twitter at Project Liberal. But I want to say thank you both again for your time. Have a wonderful week, a great Easter holiday, and I will talk to you all soon. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Good question. Great conversation.